Welcome again, Miloszka Julie, to the second panel on Scene B. Our panelists have taken their seats, so we can kick off. The subject is fuel and defense, the role of liquid fuels and transmission infrastructure for EU security and defense. A very hot topic, and the moderator will be Agnieszka Łakoma. Agnieszka is a journalist specializing in economy, energy, raw materials, energy security, and climate policy. Let's give her a warm welcome. Put your hands together for our moderator. Thank you, everyone, for coming, for your patience. There was a bit of a delay, so thanks for bearing with us. I have our speakers with us. Former Minister of Climate and Energy, Anna Łukaszewska-Trzeciakowska, welcome. Paweł Pikus, representing Ernst & Young, expert in the energy sector, and the former head of PERN, MIROSŁAW SKOWRON. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to give a special warm call to MIROSŁAW, who will be talking about this huge investment project. Will it be successful or not? We'll see. But this is very serious because energy security is always multifaceted, multidimensional. We use the word very often. But one of the key dimensions of security is stability of supply. Safe and secure supply of liquid fuels. Right after the Russians' aggressions in the Ukraine, I'm sure if you recall, 3.5 years ago, we all witnessed what happened at gas stations in Poland. It was enough for the news to break that the war has started in Ukraine, and Poles all drove to gas stations. There were no problems with supply. There were no shortages. We did not run out of fuel, and we've managed to deal quite well with this crisis. And the question is, to what extent will we be secure in the years to come? Has anything changed here or not? And the question is, to what extent our infrastructural ties, pipelines, all kinds of pipelines for natural gas and oil and fuel. I mean, do we have to redefine the infrastructure? Should we take a fresh look at it? What to do for the infrastructure to provide secure supply of fuels for Poland and energy security for Poland? It's worth noting that stable fuel supply gives us, let's say, the spiritual stability of community. If people hear that we can run out of fuel, then people think it's getting serious and it might be cause for a panic. Now let's kick off our panel. Thank you for accepting the invitation once again. So we're talking about the role of liquid fuels, and the question is, can we really feel safe and secure at this juncture, when on the one hand, behind the border we have the war, and on the other hand we have infrastructure we've always been trusting for many years, supplying continuity of supply for many years, but the infrastructure is somehow tied with the current setup we've been involved in for decades, because we had the Polish People's Republic, the communist state, with ties with Russia, so we managed to deal with this as a state, but maybe it's the right time to change our approach to the role of fuel infrastructure and transmission infrastructure in the fuel sector in Poland. Minister, well, there are a number of components we have to remember. First of all, we've been quite active in the meantime. When the United Right were in power and the Boronów-Trzebinia pipeline was built, new warehouses in the north were built, Naftoport has increased its capacity, its throughput, and technology in the Płock refinery has changed enough that we could get rid of Russian Repco oil and to start importing Saudi oil with similar parameters, or oil from around the world. We had the right infrastructure in place to accept it from the sea and to push it north or south, really, to the refinery and to store it in tanks. We've all developed this. Is this enough? It's not, obviously. We have to continue this, and we've had some plans. I do hope that they are being implemented at the moment, because as what you said is true. If there's any crisis, let's say social crisis, or there's any external threat, regardless whether it's COVID, or the breakout of large-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine, or the news that something happened in a refinery, or, I don't know, the banking crisis or any other crash, there's a run on toilet paper and fuel. It's always like this. There's a run on supermarkets and gas stations. I remember as a plenipotentiary for infrastructure how difficult it was for rail transportation to fit within all the windows, for the fuel to be pushed towards the gas stations with this increased demand. God forbid it ran out for a second, because the panic would skyrocket. And on that we have to overlay the climate policy. Unfortunately, more and more corporations close their refineries or reduce their production capacity, while we are not getting rid of our cars. We have more and more cars on the streets. That's why it's very tense on the European diesel market, which does not make our lives any easier for the state and the companies supplying fuel, to ensure that we do not run out of fuel on gas supplies to provide the continuity of supplies. And there's also prices, obviously. We have usually no impact on global fuel prices. We have to try and maintain them at a level that allows Poles to feel secure, or Europeans to feel safe and secure. I'm going on a tangent here, but there's ES2, but let's leave it here. And there's this tense geopolitical situation. Tensions are running high. We have to be ready more to respond to the threat from the east, and there's a huge role of NATO and our own military, for NATO pipelines to reach further than the Odra River, and to increase our safety at the level of military fuel supply, and supplying resources to the military that, God forbid, but could be very necessary on the eastern flank. So this is both social, economic, technological and political. There are all these dimensions from the point of view of climate policy and military security. There are all these dimensions intertwined. Thank you, Minister. I mean, we're not running out of fuel-powered cars, internal combustion engine cars. The numbers are growing. There's the electromobility policy of the EU, but we're still using ICE engines, and the continuity of supply is the key for economy to flourish and for society to have this elementary feeling of security. And I do suspect this will not change soon, in future years, despite this ban on new ICE cars in 2035. But returning to what's been happening in the last 3 years, Paweł, what do you think? Have we reached the maximum of things possible, or could we have done more? Can we really say that the infrastructure is ready? We'll talk about NATO separately. It's a separate, broad subject, and some of the panel will be devoted to it. But for now, let's try and paint it in broad strokes. Based on our experience, on our background, the President will talk about the company. At the company level, while I will focus on what's been happening at the governmental level in recent years. So we should start by saying, as we discussed in the gas panel, let's see what happened with the market. What happened with prices and our approach to the fuel sector when the war broke out and when all this geopolitical turbulence started. Apart from what you said, that there was a momentary psychological imbalance, nothing else happened. We still stay in a secure and safe country. There is no problems with access to fuels. It's all running well, and the transition was very smooth and calm, without significant issues. And we owe it to how the last 8-10 years During the last 8 years, we've been perceiving energy security and fuel and raw material security at the governmental level. What really happened in 2010, 2011 in the gas sector, in our negotiations with Gazprom, opened our eyes and showed us that we have to get serious. We should not play with our security, because what happened in 2010 in the gas sector can happen at any time in any other fuel sector, which is exposed to high risk of dependence. As a result, in specific energy policies, in consecutive energy policies of the state, we focused on the necessary investments in new import capacity or diversification contracts that have to take place for us to talk about functioning safely an economy if something happens anytime. And before the large-scale conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the Russian aggression, we saw such a crisis in the fuel sector. The president here will talk about this. A chlorine crisis. He told us that we have to improve our infrastructural resistance very deeply, because we might face a situation when the direction we're dependent on, or we are using due to economic reasons at a given moment, can run out. And for the Polish fuel system, this was a shock test or stress test before 2020, or what happened later. This was a test that we can say we have passed very well. Okay, President? And we just, it's been all rosy and it's great. It's hard work for many years, as the speaker has just said before me. During recent years, the infrastructure. So we can hear another speaker from another panel from the speaker. So just a second, we are witnessing some technical issues because we are hearing a speaker from another scene, actually.
Mamy takie usługi państwowe, które są bardzo mocno oparte o cyfryzację. Mamy obywatela, z którego korzysta prawie 18 milionów Polaków.
Przepraszamy Państwa bardzo, mamy tutaj odsłuch, po prostu musimy się go chwilowo pozbyć, więc momencik, Panie Prezydencie. O, już jest w porządku.
Udało się, więc możemy wracać. Tak, to prawda, w ostatnich 80 latach zostało...
In the last 10 years we've done really a lot as far as preparing the critical infrastructure is concerned for fuel transmission and oil transmission. This improvement, security improvement, is in one part maintaining the flow in operations, spending a few $100 million a year to maintain our assets and to increase our storage capacity. You are the plenipotentiary for critical infrastructure. Many of these investment projects have been completed. Many tanks were built, mainly to boost our retention. You have to remember that the company managing the transmission infrastructure, or PERM, is working for all the refineries across Poland, 2 refineries in Poland, and 1 refinery in Germany. You mentioned the other one during the previous panel. I mean, they are buying their oil themselves, and the EU has not solved this issue so far. Rosneft is still operating with this refinery, and Capco, Kazakh, theoretically Kazakh oil is flowing there. Theoretically, it's practically flowing there. Around 1 million tons a year are sent to this refinery. So returning to our security now, the whole pipeline, the northern pipeline, supplying Lotos and Płock refineries, in its most sensitive places is protected. There are additional lines which are tried and tested on a regular basis, so we are not really facing the risk of shortages or stopping the supply. You know, stores, as far as fuel and oil is concerned, are also operational, when undergoing technical inspection. They're covered by an O&M program, so we need to integrate the systems somehow. This is what you mentioned, because we are separate from reality. If something happens, let's say we're increasing fuel supplies, there are traffic jams on the railways because there are some overhaul works. Other trains have to pass, for example, because the military systems are work with loading and unloading differently than civil systems. This causes a lot of operational issues that should be solved at a systemic level. We cannot really use various technical solutions within a single system, because just in case it will make it difficult to satisfy all the requirements to increase our safety. So today I would say that from the point of view of a company managing pipelines, if we're talking about fuels, if we're talking about crude oil, the safety is there owing to all the work we have done for many years. Should we improve it? Should we provide maintenance? Yes, we should integrate the systems as well. We should also be able to integrate these operations across Europe to maintain the stock levels and security systems, because these systems are intertwined. And we're talking about physical transmission, but also what can be stored where, because there are some ideas to store our supplies abroad, or for Ukraine to store their fuel in Poland. These plans did not come to fruition. Now, just to add something, we don't have a map with pipelines and tanks. It's easy to supply. We have so let's put it this way, explain this way. We have the Naftoport, the oil port in Gdańsk, our window to the world where we take oil from, and there is a system of pipelines distributing it. Because Naftoport is in Gdańsk, we have a refinery in Gdańsk, second largest in Poland, largest in Płock. And this is where the northern pipeline goes to, that the President mentioned. I'm just explaining. If this is obvious for you, apologies, but just in case, so that we're on the same page here. We also have storage facilities, tanks, and PERN, this company that was headed by MIROSŁAW. PERN also provides transmission services. For example, for German refineries Leuna and Schwedt, the same Schwedt refinery we covered during the previous panel, in part, in over 50%, it's owned by the Russian Rosneft corporation. It might seem complex at the first sight, but generally speaking, this is the general picture. Please follow up on that. It's worth adding that pipelines we have, obviously the friendship or przyjaźń pipeline goes from west to east to Poznań, to the center of Poland. This section is just the only to send oil to the Schwedt refinery. Our companies are not using it anymore. Leuna is not using it anymore. It's owned by Total Energy. The western section from the center of Poland to the western border is fully utilized as far as transmission capacity is concerned. And actually, it would be all right not to use the western section, but it's like an additional reserve, additional storage for us, because it's defined, it has to be defined in the Act. We're trying to change the regulations, but we failed for the pipeline to be a storage tank of sorts at the same time. Now, if Schwedt refinery were to stop buying oil from us, we would have additional security provided by this additional storage for Poland. And we could also settle this on a regular basis, like we're doing it today for oil supplies between PERN and our off-takers without using Russian solutions. What's happening at the border today in Adamów, on the Polish-Belarusian border, this settlement or clearance systems is still Russian, and it would be good to depart from it. At the beginning I said that we should change our approach to infrastructure in Poland and to really look west. We are stuck with our one leg in the old times. It's not us. Customers are stuck in the old times. Oh, let's put it this way. All right, that's the truth, really. Talking about the operation of pipelines, PERN does not own the fuel or crude oil in this case. And we have to talk about this. We have to be aware of that. It's our responsibility. We are not responsible for that. We are just transmitting it based on contracts. Somebody's utilizing our infrastructure because there's the contract and there are sanctions in the EU, and that's the present-day regulatory situation. But finally, at the European level, we should have the right management, which is not collaborating with Rosneft. When you're talking about these companies being shut down, the refineries being shut down, let's use some simpler words for people who are not experts in these issues could understand me. We as Poland are taking all the oil or the crude oil used in Poland through the sea, through the harbor. It's not Russian in origin. Thanks to the hard work of many people at Orlen, at Naftoport harbor, we have increased our capacity of accepting it, and technological changes that took place in refineries in Orlen allowed us to process non-Russian crude oil, because it also took some financial export. So there are various grades of oil with various chemical compositions. Not like every refinery can process all kinds of oil. So this is an issue of Schwedt refinery as well. It's because when the US imposed sanctions against Russian companies, Chancellor Merz mentioned that he would like to exclude the Schwedt refinery from that. They are still processing oil that needs to have specific chemical composition, and that's the Russian Repco. It turned out that also Kazakh Kepco turned out to be identical. And from the north to the south, we have our Naftoport pipeline to Polish refineries that's later connected with the Przyjaźń or Friendship East-West, the so-called Druzhba pipeline. And then on the east, from the east, we also have so-called Kazakh Kepco for the Schwedt refinery, and later on, we also have what's imported by Germany through the sea, through the Naftoport, and this is it's the joint line or joint section that transports refinery to German refineries. And that's the whole, let's say, setup, that's the whole geography, or that's the whole picture in general, in a nutshell. It's important that you mention that. We could really stop using the eastern part from the eastern border to Płock. It's used by Germans just for a single refinery, importing oil that they are calling and invoicing as Kazakh. And I have serious doubts about that. Everybody knows where the oil comes from, but the invoice is issued by Kazakhstan. Now, should we change that? For sure, we should change that at the European level. We should start looking who is buying what oil and what their true origin is, and to also think where else we could buy oil from. There are some ideas also with the involvement of harbors along the Black Sea, but Ukrainian ports.
Thank you for that. Paweł, comment on that? What I would also like to add is that the situation is good. If it's good, it's not good forever. The dynamics of the sector show that we still need to think about what can still be improved or adjust to the changing circumstances. I'll move on to what you've asked about in a second. But it's not limited to these topics only. The scope is much broader. What the supply system, gas and oil supply system, should look like, given our geopolitical situation. The question relates to, firstly, the infrastructure, and so Can we rest on laurels, or we should continue extending the infrastructure and the tanks capacity, or should we think how the strategic reserve system works? Do we have enough capacity for specific fuels, and in crisis emergencies we have access to whatever fuels we need, for instance aviation fuel? So we've done a lot, but still ahead. A lot is still ahead. So what should be the priorities? When it comes to strategic reserve, the hard work that's been done in terms of extending the Naftoport or storage capacity, we are on the safe side. But when it comes to aviation fuel, every airport works independently. PERN does not work there. The only project that's been started in that respect was the CPK project, which is only one component of fuel storage. But that's something that's most needed currently, and that's something we should continue working on. Controlling demand and supply, because that's the basis for capacities. We need to remember that building capacity is a relatively short process in investment terms, 2 or 3 years. So the investment process, that's a relatively short period of time. While watching of what will be happening on the market, especially that our phasing out from fossil fuels will not look like the whole European Union wishes or the Green Deal stipulates. So whatever analysis we run, there will be some shift. The storage capacities will be needed, and we need to keep working on that. 3 elements. Paweł, you mentioned 3 elements. Which ones are most important? Minister, Madam, I think what Marek, Paweł and Mirek said, we need to keep working on our readiness or our storage capacity. We still, at least in my opinion, we're still missing something, especially when it comes to aviation fuel. Especially when all the airports work on their own, we would need a joint strategy. For years, we've struggled with something, and that's a business approach based on certain strategies that were based on EU strategies. Investment decisions for expansion of transfer, storage, purchase capacities, given the stories that in 2035 we will have no combustion engine vehicles, makes making decisions, investment decisions, more risky and more difficult. So that's something that we should handle. We won't have green aviation fuels for a long time. The same applies to e-fuels. So the infrastructure, despite the union requirements, will not be ready. That's the risk you've mentioned. It's clear that the geopolitical component in the whole picture needs to be kept in mind. The world has changed. The world changed in 2022. I'd like to draw your attention to one thing. When did it start? Expansion of the Naftoport. It was in the 70s. The investment and all that happened, in 2022, we would have been in a much more difficult situation. So an investment or a decision made decades before made our situation much easier. So the investment efforts done in recent years were enormous when it comes to gas and oil. Gas and oil used by the economy on a daily basis. So the decisions need to be made. You're saying that the decisions are difficult. They are difficult and they will always be difficult because sometimes they will be not justified economically. That is why we have companies like PERN, like gas system, that needs to take the risk of economically unjustified decisions. Not everything can be calculated in the long perspective. We cannot foresee everything, but the point of view from a few decades ago helped us be safer much later. Isn't it that the role of the state is to take into account the strategic companies like PERN or gas system to make certain investments? They have that in their charters. I remember a big discussion if the charter of any company can include stipulation of unprofitable undertakings that are important for Poland's strategy or policy. Oh, the discussions were very fierce. There were many opponents of that view 20 years ago, but I believe we are mature, especially bearing in mind what is happening in the East. There is some risk and responsibility, if not accountability. But it's good to, as we've heard a second ago, most important strategic companies are separate and they have the same management system. So they have the same idea, the same concept, similar status, but when it comes to strategic issues, it's the safety that takes paramount, that are paramount. It's about ensuring continuity of safety from the state point of view. So let's stick to it and leave these provisions in the charters of companies. It could be dangerous, precisely, so that's a positive sign. Now let's move on to a part that's very future-related. Very future-related investment. And whose importance is comparable to CPK. Poland joining NATO pipelines poses a question. On the one hand, if we are in NATO, if we've been in NATO for so long, why haven't we joined the network already? And on the other hand, isn't it too late? Have we snoozed? And finally, is it a feasible investment? 300 kilometers of pipeline, oil pipelines, and 20 billion zloty. So that's an enormous undertaking. What is your take on that? Of course, it is feasible. 300 kilometers. It's not that much. It's not a huge investment. Well, there are permits and so on and so forth. Of course there are. Ladies and gents, if we are to do an important investment, PSC is a great example. High and medium voltage grids. There are acts that stipulate the whole process for efficient execution. It's nothing surprising from a technical point of view. I'm an engineer. I used to run big investments, 11 billion zloty worth. The process, the investment is not that difficult, both in formal and legal terms and in technical terms. Economy and finances, okay. The NATO pipelines that were built in the 50s and 60s of the previous century were financed with NATO funds. In the 70s, the burden was taken over by the countries where they were located, the pipelines were located. Currently, the pipelines are used for both military and commercial purposes. Maybe even more for commercial purposes than for military purposes, because we haven't had too many conflicts in the west of Europe. Should the pipelines be erected, built? Yes. It's something, as we said a second ago, remember that we have the raw oil infrastructure insured and secured. We have the infrastructure for other fuels. And now, when we come across an emergency, we have one naftoport, oil port. We have pipelines. Ships need to go through Danish straits, and that's a bottleneck in our part of the world. Blocking the straits will stop the supply of the fuel, so we need a different infrastructure as soon as possible. An infrastructure that would let us, that when faced with 2022 situation somewhere else, we need fuel supply. It's not only about Poland, but other NATO countries as well. Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, because that's where the pipeline would be built. So the decision needs to be made. As Madam Minister, when she used to be our boss, the process was initiated, but it needs to be urgently continued. And I'm not talking about more documents signed in front of cameras and in the limelight. But the infrastructure needs to be actually made closer. How much fuel will we need? We know that it's difficult. None of us knows currently. I suspect that even the military people do not know what the future battle field will look like, what will be the needs. But we cannot just leave it because of that. Paweł, does everybody understand that? Is there enough understanding? We've seen a conference or two official contract signing. Okay, I'm glad that the conferences have been held, because it's a process that was prepared much earlier. It was prepared and proceeded earlier, so I'm happy to see that there is some progress. But I wouldn't cry wolf because of the complexity of the whole thing and the difficulties faced. Gas system, for instance, currently builds pipelines from between Włocławek and Gdańsk. That's 250 kilometers, and it'll take them 3 or 4 years. So what we've just heard, we know how to do it. Over the last 10 years, we've delivered hard work to know how to handle such infrastructure undertakings. Administrative point of view, financial point of view, technical point of view. We all have it covered. We know how to balance resources and funds. So that's not something I'd be afraid of. What we need currently, I believe, is to redefine on the governmental, on a state point of view, the safety policy, and to base it on different paradigms. Let's take a look at the fuel sector with the gas sector point of view. Building resilience. In gas sector, we have the Świnoujście terminal, but we know what's happening globally. That's why we build the north-south corridor. And if we have difficulties somewhere else, we can diversify it. We can get some gas from Lithuania, from the south. We can get some gas from Germany to use the extended storage facilities, and that's happening. Another thing is that the challenges that we have in energy sectors in general are bigger than we expected a few years ago. Who would have guessed what would be crucial for the battlefield nowadays? So a few years ago, what was discussed was how to secure basic infrastructure elements with anti-drone systems. Take a look at what Ukraine is doing with their key components of the infrastructure, be it heat plants or something. They concrete it in so that they are resilient to hybrid attacks, not strictly military forces, but things like small drones that are still able to damage it. To conclude, we need to redefine all these things. We need to look for new threats, and I'm happy that there are things taking happening, but there needs to be more actions. We know how to build, we know how to diversify. You've mentioned the gas interconnectors, that's something to boast about. Let's also remember that we were responsible for that, and we succeeded in that. Making the Baltics unreliable on Russian gas and oil. We supported Ostrołęka-Stanisław-Lithuania line that helped them cut off the Russian line. So we know how to build. What is needed is the will and something more certain effectiveness that I can see certain shortages of. There is readiness in the companies. I know that people have worked and are working hard on that. We need, okay, we also need funds for all of that. But there is the 2028-35 budget perspective. As far as I remember, we have 130 billion euro and for dual-use infrastructure. So these issues need to be covered by those documents. So we have the funds for the construction. Obviously, it can be used commercially too. But these conferences need to be followed with specific plans and specific agendas and schedules for winning EU funding, NATO funding, cooperation for construction of the infrastructure. There is a third path, that is extend or build another line from Ukraine, from Odessa. I know that we have Odessa is an evergreen project, but the policy has changed. An additional source of oil from that direction becomes more and more important, regionally more and more important. Well, it's true, but the question is does everybody in the European Commission understand that? We're facing the new budgeting period, and this is a key investment, and the money should be there. Well, you're right, but it will not happen by itself. We have 27 member states in Europe, and each of the states has its own needs. But there are also other. Culture also wants to join it, but the blanket is always too short. The money will not be. There will not be enough money for everything that everybody needs. The role of the state is preparing a project and presenting it, promoting it at the European level, so that it's high on the priority list. And the funds are secured. Bulgarians have their needs. All the countries, north to south, have their needs facing the eastern threat. The south has its needs. It will not happen by itself. So let me ask a question to Paweł. Is the government doing enough for having it happen? I'd like to believe that. It's in the interest of us all. What Madam Minister said, let's take a look at NATO spending on defense. They're not interested in 5% for defense. It's not their war. There are countries that say that. Joint policy, certain security status for the whole Europe, and redesigning objectives so that the eastern flank has some extra funding and that dual-use economies grow. I can just say from my experience in other sectors that Polish industry is just waiting to get involved in such undertakings. If the Ministry of Development, the Ministry of Funds announced KPO or the National Restructuring Fund finances, so Polish industry is willing to contribute their products, be it steel or whatever they offer. So they are ready to cry all aboard. I'd like it not to be just a slogan. I'd like to see it happen. But it's also worth looking from a different perspective. It's a big opportunity for Polish companies, for Polish industry, because these are strategic investments. Mirosław, one more question for you related to execution as such. So far, we've only known there would be investment plans prepared and that would be followed with a decision also made at the NATO level if those plans would be executed. Is that a challenge to us, or should it be a formality of us? Is the design or planning process extending too much?
So as the speakers before me have already said, all hands on deck. All hands on deck. We have to start working on this project. We need to have the data to prepare this project. And my talks with NATO representatives indicate that there is the will to do that. There is a need to do it. They do feel the need of extending these pipelines because they know how the situation can develop in the future. So it's worth to be prepared for that. I cannot really answer the question whether this will be just a mere formality or we will have to make certain efforts for the decision to be made. The most important thing is that it's happening, that we have started this process, that we're talking about this, and it's very important at the government level to give priority to this project so that everybody knows that it should be successful. It shouldn't just be a piece of paper. And what's even more important, we need to set a deadline for it, quite an early deadline, because this will only improve our security. And for us, it will be great for the project to accelerate, regardless who is running it, who is building it. There are some projects that are timeless, and they just have to be completed. What about activists? If I may follow up on that, the essence of it's being built or not, that's the brutal reality around it, whether we will find the funds for that, whether we will have the funds earmarked for it. This depends on something that we call project maturity. On the one hand, it's great to say that we would like to have a pipeline. On the other, when we're applying for funds or looking for financing, we need to have a specific project to know what we want to build exactly, what parameters, where exactly. Is it feasible? Is it possible? Why do we need it? It needs to be written in an application which has to be very specific and concrete, which goes far beyond the narrative of just a general security of the eastern flank. We have to be very specific. I know how difficult it was when we worked on these interconnector with Lithuania. Delays, in many cases, resulted on the Polish side, more often on the Lithuanian side, resulted from the lack of will to complete the project. It's true, we need to have all the right parameters. This is a technical project. We need to know where it has to be built, where we should have these storage facilities, where the pipelines should go, what the filling up level will be of these tanks. We need to have these parameters. I do concur. This has to be calculated and written so that we can find the right funds for that. Let me just add, like any project, this project, which will be a dual-use project, needs to be economically viable and be based on a viable business model. It's not rocket science. We've done that before. We've built this Świnoujście terminal, and then the FSR was also built like that. So it will all work, but we just need to know how to do it. And these magical provisions in the statutes of companies can also help us. But it's key to find the right idea for that and to want to use this. It's also happening in crude oil and fuels. All the tanks built today are built commercially with customers. Customers are ordering the right capacity, they're signing the right contracts, making the project commercially viable so that it's self-financed investment-wise. As I mentioned before, that's what happened in Western Europe with NATO pipelines. They evolved towards the full market-based model. They were fully commercial, so it's doable, it's feasible. That's what I mentioned. It's great that you agree, so that we don't think it's enough to say, okay, we're here along the eastern flank of NATO. It's dangerous. There are these political threats. Give us 5 zlotys. It's not. It won't work like that. We need to have a well-matured, professionally drafted project with its economic viability, with the idea of how to do it, with a study, initial study of feasibility study, where it should go, where should it be connected, why here, not there, how it should be supplied, who should be responsible for that. And unfortunately, my impression is, I hope I'm wrong, that very often the decision makers stop at the PR level. So we have a great idea, we'll just go and announce it, we'll take some cool photos, and it should just work on its own. But the rules are obvious for everyone who ever participated in such a project. You have a project, you need to defend it, you have to be better than many projects applied for across Europe because you don't have enough funds for everyone. You have to fight for that. You have to know where you want to build something and for how much money. Yes, so there are some unknowns. We're not really sure what the approach of the government will be outside of these conferences. We're not really sure whether we will have the money earmarked for that in the EU budget for this project. But assuming that all the conditions are met, how much time would we need to execute this, to build it? Let's say we have the NATO go-ahead, we have the green light, and the government is working hard, and we have the funds. How much do we need to develop that? I mean, it's not a complex project. What is more, some of the storage infrastructure is already there, because the tanks which are being extended today in PERN bases can be used. If the CPK Central Port or Airport project starts, this will be another place where the storage tanks will be placed. Both the pipes and tanks can be built in parallel. It takes a few years. I can't really tell you exactly. I'm not talking about the design phase here. Once the decision is made, we should have special acts accelerating it, so the design process should not be complex or lengthy. It should maybe take 2 or 3 years. The construction itself, as I mentioned before, talking about tanks, it's 2 or 3 years only. Pipelines can be built in parallel. So for the Pomerania section, 3 years. It should take 3 years if the project were to be built, looking at the schedule from Gdańsk to Płock. So these are not long investment processes, just a few years. I also heard 2 years of the design phase and 5 or 4 years, so 7 years in total. But do you think that we will be successful? We will make it in 7 years, by 2030, 32? Depends how determined all the stakeholders are. Like with every infrastructural project, there will be many risks on the way. It's not a complex project, so fewer than in this flagship project of the nuclear power plant. We are not determined enough. If it's, all the stakeholders are not prepared well, if there is not enough will to follow the schedule, there will be one delay after another, and we can just go on for many years. So I do hope everyone is determined enough. All the companies are ready for that, and both gas system and PERN and PSE, in the times where I was responsible for that, were very effective in their investment projects. So let's hope this happens. It is possible, but whether it will happen, well, it depends on the people responsible. Exclusively, because every investment project is based on people. Once all the formal obstacles are overcome, now if we have all the legislation in place, the rest is just determination. This a special act. I mean, it's just a structural, linear infrastructure. There should be an act allowing us to quickly cite these linear projects. Otherwise, it will be difficult. I mean, we know, I mean, 15 or 20 years ago, it was difficult for PSE to invest without having this special act of law. Only once the special investment legislation went into force, they increased the rate of investment. This is just a tool. We need to have a special act to have these linear projects done quickly and efficiently. Isn't it so that this special act should actually be in the pipeline already? Pun intended? Now, if we get stuck at the level of a special act of the regulation, it means that we don't have enough will or determination to do it. There could be a litmus test of how the government approaches the project. Preparing these special acts until 2023 has never been an issue. Whenever they were needed, we always had them ready. And they have never caused a huge risk in the whole process. Now, talking about the will now, because you mentioned when there's a will, there's a way. But if the project is prepared well and we have the will, it will function well. Let's talk about FSR. By 2023, it was prepared well, and today the project is not delayed, and people responsible for it today adopted it as its own, as a strategic project. Colloquially, they're just pushing forward. They're making inroads. So, well, you ended on an optimistic note, provided that we see a draft special act. So it will show that there is an opportunity to do it. Let me just tell you, just to supplant it, hasn't been so easy with energy infrastructure. And there was this infamous investment project of PSE around Kurnik. In Kurnik, the construction took 8 years because there was an issue with buying a piece of land without this special act related to expropriation. If we're talking about infrastructural projects, I think the challenges abound. We have the last 5 minutes. Do you have any questions or speakers? If so, please ask a question, but please wait for the microphone so that the interpreters can interpret what you're saying. First thing is that we don't really need a special act. We already have a law about special investment projects for the defense of the state. Second of all, it's enough to add one item to the special oil act, like for the act with terminals. When we were missing a gas pipeline, you just had to add some words. It was just enough to amend it a bit. It wasn't a problem just to build it later on. Now, President, if you could just tell us, what does it mean that the Polish system uses Russian standards? And fourth, isn't it so that the Schwedt refinery cannot process any other oil, but it's just less profitable? We heard the same arguments in 2005 and 4 and 6. When the Płock refinery was unable to process any other oil than Russian, and the spread and the land premium per barrel, it was around $2. It was there, and as a result, Orlen would process Russian oil because it was more profitable for it, not because they did not have the right infrastructure or columns for distillation, for hydrocracking devices, etc. Thank you. Just to follow up, talking about these special acts, you're obviously right, but you have to always add the amendment. There needs to be a time. Sometimes adding just an item. It's not just somebody just crosses out in the morning and overnight it's there. It has to follow its legislative path. Now, talking about standards, let me reiterate what I said today, verbatim. PERN is not responsible for oil. We don't own the oil. We don't own the molecule. And the company supplying KEPCO oil to Schwedt refinery demands settlement based on Russian standards, because this is their clearance or settlement system between these partners. So we have nothing to do with that. Just to explain, we as Poland, or we as a company, as a subsidiary, we just accept the test results. We have to know what's flowing into our system. So this is the picture. This is what it looks like. Now talk about oil processing, you mentioned. That's the bottom line. It's always about the bottom line. Why Russians are using that, why Rosneft is using that. Because it's cheaper to send oil using pipelines. And they are using oil from this direction. Now, could they adjust their equipment? Yes, they would need to obviously invest into the OPEX and CAPEX, but this would increase the production costs. Let me just add that it's true to have the right mix. Orlen invested a lot, not because it was a folly, they just needed it. It was economically viable. And I do agree, apart from technology actually, a decisive factor to keep importing Kazakh KEPCO is the bottom line. As the border price for Russian oil on the global market, there's the Kazakhs markup, and still it's cheaper than oil from other regions, and it's totally obvious. But let me reiterate, I will stick to that. Apart from the bottom line, which is obvious, what's behind it is the lack of will to invest into changing the technology. Would you like to react to it? No? Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? No, I don't see any. All right, then. So let me thank our panelists. I'd like to thank you for your attention and for your patience. I think we will be returning to the subject matter. I do hope that these provisions will appear in the Special Act and this famous connection in 7 years will become reality. And we should all wish that. Thank you so much.
Dzień dobry. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to address this year's Poznan Economic Congress, especially as we confront the hard reality shaping European security and defense. One critical topic is energy resilience, specifically the role of liquefied fuel infrastructure in strengthening our defense posture and operational readiness. Europe's ability to defend itself relies not only on soldiers and systems, but also on the logistical backbone that sustains them. Pipelines, storage facilities, refueling corridors, these are not luxuries. They are operational necessities. Tanks do not roll, aircraft do not fly, and supply chains do not function without secure, timely access to fuel. In a crisis, the absence of infrastructure becomes a liability, one that can paralyze even the best equipped force. Today, the eastern flank remains exposed, and the condition and coverage of liquid fuel infrastructure, especially dual use, falls short of what NATO's logistical requirements demand. This isn't just inefficient, it's dangerous. It creates a critical vulnerability along the EU's external borders, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, that adversaries can exploit. Dual-use infrastructure is not only about supporting military deployments. It is also strengthens civil resilience, enabling rapid crisis response, disaster management, and national continuity in emergencies. Investment in this space builds a value far beyond defense. That's why the Rearmed Defense Omnibus, currently in a trialogue, is a vital step. It rightly prioritizes infrastructure projects in frontline regions, where the security risks are highest and the gaps are the most pressing. The message is simple. Defense must be mobile, fast, and sustained. That requires fuel in the right place at the right time under any condition. No amount of funding or political will matters if we cannot move and supply our forces when it counts. At the same time, we must be honest about another looming threat. Europe's liquid fuel production capacity is shrinking. Why? Because EU refineries are weighted down by soaring energy prices, strict emission costs under the emission trading system, and unfair global competition. These burdens make it harder for EU industry to compete. and easier for the third country suppliers, often with no environmental or strategic obligations, to take their place. The result? Europe loses capacity. And when that happens, we lose control of our own supply chains. This isn't just an industrial problem. It's security liability. Our defense forces cannot be dependent on fuel from unreliable or adversarial sources. Strategic autonomy begins with production and infrastructure. And if we fail to protect our refinery base and transmission network, we expose our armed forces to external pressure at the worst possible time. That is unacceptable. NATO's call for action on this is clear. Allies are already pushing for expanded pipeline capacity and more robust storage. The EU must now match that urgency with clear policy, focused funding, and accelerated implementation. So let me conclude with this. Fuel infrastructure is defense infrastructure. We must stop treating it as a second-tier issue. Our deterrence posture depends on it. Our security depends on it. I wish you a focused and forward-looking discussion on this vital issue, and I thank you for your attention.